When I agreed to stay the weekend with my younger brother, I thought I was just catching up on lost time. I had no idea it would unravel everything I thought I understood about us. I made my younger brother and I an irresistible offer after our parents abandoned us, and it would lead to some of the most thrilling days of our lives. I'm Julia, and I never thought I'd end up in this situation. I grew up with an unbreakable bond with my younger brother, Jake. I always cared about him, even though he was 5 years younger than me, after being shielded from bullies and given study support. However, life started pulling us in various directions over time. While Jake was still in high school, I attended college and subsequently started working while we were still figuring out who we wanted to be. Due to their rigorous work schedules, our parents rarely had time for their families. They weren't inattentive, but they were often absent, so I took over a lot of Jake's care duties as soon as I was old enough to drive and do household chores. It was never a sense of obligation, but always cheerful and willing to please. He was a pleasure to be around. It was not a chore to look after him. It was just a part of our identity. But after I moved out, everything was different. I had moved into a little flat across town by the time I was 20. Every time I thought about how much I was missing from Jake's life, guilt tore at me because I didn't spend as much time at home as I should have. The reality that the carefree little brother I knew was slowly changing into someone I hardly recognized was more painful than I wanted to acknowledge. Jake was left alone one weekend when our parents announced that they would be going on a 3-day business trip. With a voice full of worry, my mother called. She questioned, "Can you stick with him?" I largely consented out of regret. He's old enough to handle things, but knowing you're there would make me feel better. Since I didn't have any important plans, spending time with Jake might help us get along better. Jake greeted me at the door with his trademark crooked smile when I got there. He pulled me into a quick embrace and said, "Stranger, it has been a long time since we last met." Yeah, I said, rolling my eyes while smiling. "Did you miss me?" He grinned and moved aside to let me enter. The house appeared exactly the Jakey, neat, but lived in with the slight aroma of Lemon's cleanser. Walking inside seemed strangely unreal, like returning to my adolescent years. That first night, we spent hours catching up. Jake discussed school, his friends, and his college ambitions, while I provided details about my own life. It felt good, like old days, to close the gap that had formed between us over time. For a while, nothing seemed to have changed. But as the night progressed, I began to notice details about Jake that I had previously overlooked.
He was no longer a small kid.
He'd gotten taller, his shoulders broader, and his voice deeper. He exuded a serene confidence and maturity that I had not seen before. And this threw me off. I struggled to connect the youngster I once protected with the young man seated across from me. After supper, Jake recommended we watch a movie. He remarked something good as he flipped through the options on the television. "Not one of those dull dramas you enjoy." "Excuse me," I teased while seeming to be offended. "My choice in movies is impeccable." He smirked and finally chose a comedy that we had seen numerous times before. As the opening titles rolled, he sank onto the couch next to me and stretched out his long legs. For a while, it was simple to forget about everything else and just live in the moment. We laughed at familiar jokes, recited lines we both knew by memory, and settled into a comfortable pace. But every now and then I noticed Jake seemed lost in thought, as if something was weighing on him. I dismissed it, telling myself I was simply overthinking things. After all, he is my brother. The way he looked at me was not odd. Was it there? When the movie ended, Jake stretched and yawned. "I'm going to get a drink," he remarked, standing up and walking for the kitchen. I stayed on the couch mindlessly going through my phone. A few minutes later, his voice rang forth. "Hey, Julia, do you want anything?" "Sure," I responded.
Surprise-me.
When he returned, he was holding 2 cups of cola. He sat down again, this time a little closer, and handed me one. His knee lightly touched mine. It reminded me how much he'd grown, but I didn't think much of it. "Thank you," I said, attempting to maintain my voice level. He shrugged and took a sip. "Not an issue." We sat in silence for a while with only the faint hum of the television filling the room. I tried to focus on my phone, but his presence was strangely distracting. I could feel the warmth flowing from him and the occasional touch of his knee against mine. It was nothing, I reminded myself. It's just proximity.
But
A small, restless part of me wasn't so certain. So Jake remarked abruptly, breaking the silence. What is living like in the big city? Do you ever find yourself missing it here? His question was casual, but the way his eyes fastened on mine made me pause. I mean, yes, sometimes, I admitted while putting my phone down. However, the situation has changed. I enjoy having my own space, you know. He nodded and leaned back against the couch. I understand that. Still, it feels strange not having you around. The place seems quieter without you. I gave a slight smile. I miss being here sometimes, I said. But things change. People grow up. Yes, he mumbled, his voice quieter and almost forlorn. I suppose they do. Something about the way he said it caused my chest to constrict. As the night progressed, we kept conversing, laughing at old recollections, and teasing each other about trivial things. The strange tension I had felt before gradually dissipated, replaced by a reassuring warmth that reminded me how much I missed this. I missed him. By the conclusion of the weekend, as I was driving home, I had come to a realization. Some bonds are too strong to be broken, no matter how far apart we are in life. Jake wasn't simply my younger brother. He was my anchor, the only constant in my existence. As I drove back to my apartment, I promised myself that I would not let so much time pass before seeing him again. I cast a fleeting glance at him, noting how buried in concentration he appeared. His forehead was slightly wrinkled, and he was wearing a serious expression that I had not seen before. It made him appear older and more mature, which unsettled me. For a brief moment, I saw him not just as my younger brother, but as his own person, complete with his own challenges and complexity. That knowledge threw me off, and I moved slightly to shatter the silence. Well, I replied, keeping my tone light. You'll be out of here soon enough. College, new friends, and an entirely different lifestyle. Perhaps, he said with a shrug. But it isn't the Jackie. You've always been someone I could chat to, even when times were terrible tough. I repeated, my brow furrowed. What do you mean? He paused, his attention flitting to the floor before returning to me. Just after Dad started working full-time, and Mom grew so busy. I felt like I was mostly on my own, but you were always present. You made things easy. His words hit me hard, and shame washed over me in waves. I had no idea how much my absence had impacted him, how much he had relied on me without ever expressing. So I apologized. Jake, I mumbled. I didn't realize you felt that way. He shrugged again, but a faint smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. It is not your fault. You were dealing with your own issues, but I'm delighted you are here now, I agreed, reaching across to squeeze his shoulder. A strange awkwardness filled the room, and I quickly shifted, unsure how to break the silence. My cheeks warmed up, and I hastily glanced away. Anyway, I explained, clearing my throat. We should probably sleep. It's getting late. Yeah, he replied, straightening up and stretching. A good idea. He headed for the stairs, stopping at the bottom to turn to face me. Good night, Julia. I tried to smile as he went upstairs. After gradually letting out my breath, I discovered that I had been keeping it in. My mind was confused, and I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something had changed between us, but I couldn't identify it. After shutting off the TV, I walked to the kitchen to wash my glass. The only sound in the oddly silent house was the soft hum of the refrigerator. For a while, I watched the trees' silhouettes move in the moonlight as I stood by the window. Ideas that I couldn't put together were running through my head. I finally got into bed, but I had trouble falling asleep. I stared at the ceiling for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of the strange unease that had overtaken everything. Jake's remarks, his long looks, and his manner of speaking to me. I couldn't explain why, but it all seemed important. I woke up the following morning to the faint sound of music emanating from the kitchen. I was shocked to see how late it was when I checked the time while still groggy. Since the sun had already reached its zenith, I hastily changed into some clothes and headed downstairs while listening to music. Jake was making breakfast in the kitchen, humming along to a song on the radio. He wore sweatpants and a t-shirt, and his hair was disheveled from sleep. Though he reminded me of the little boy I used to pet and tease. What surprised me was that he was older and more self-assured. "Good morning." When I arrived, he looked up to greet me. "I prepared eggs. Do you want any?" "Yes," I said as I took a seat at the table. "Thank you." He sat down opposite me and placed a dish in front of me. His effortless smile made it hard for me to concentrate on what I was thinking. We ate in quiet seclusion for a while, the room glowing golden from the warm sunlight streaming in through the windows. "This is good," said Jake suddenly, dispelling the quiet. "It feels like old times with you here." I smiled a little as I agreed. "Yes, it does." But even as I said it, I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. The previously seamless connection we had enjoyed had been replaced with something I couldn't quite explain. Something made my chest tighten and my mind race. I knew I couldn't ignore it no matter how hard I tried. The morning passed in a blur of minor tasks and routine, but the unsaid tension between us persisted. Jake appeared at ease, whistling along to the radio as he tidied up the kitchen while I occupied myself with whatever I could find. Anything to prevent my thoughts from wandering. Every look, every word between us felt heavier than before, but I couldn't explain why. By the time lunch arrived, I was agitated. Jake proposed watching another movie, but the idea of sitting motionless made me uncomfortable. "Why don't we take a walk?" I suggested, thinking that fresh air would help clear my mind. Jake grinned. "Sounds excellent. Let me fetch my sneakers." We stepped outdoors and walked around the tranquil neighborhood, which was surrounded with enormous trees and well-trimmed lawns. No matter how much time went by, nothing appeared to change in this kind of environment. Side by side, we casually discussed my job, his classes, and the neighbor's excessively enthusiastic dog. It felt natural again, like returning to a beat we hadn't discovered in years. Even although we laughed and talked, I couldn't help but notice the way his shoulder brushed against mine, or how his glance lingered when he thought I wasn't looking. I told myself that was nothing but my thoughts running crazy. But deep down, I couldn't resist the reality. As we approached the park at the end of the street, the sight of the swings and the worn-out basketball court brought back childhood memories. Jake motioned for me to join him as he sat on one of the swings, his long legs almost touching the floor. After a moment of hesitation, I lowered myself into the swing next to him, and as I leaned back, I heard the metal chains creak. "This place hasn't changed at all," he said in a nostalgic tone. "Yeah," I muttered, letting the memories wash over me. The moment felt heavy, full of unspoken words and a tension I couldn't quite put into words. I smiled faintly and went on. "It feels like we spent half of our childhood here." "That is because we did," he said, laughing. "You insisted on pushing me on the swings all the time, even though I told you I could do it myself. You would always jump off and land in the mud, so I returned the smile." He shook his head and laughed. "Mom forced you to promise to keep me out of trouble." His laughter subsided, and his demeanor darkened as he turned to look toward the horizon. "You were always keeping an eye on me." Naturally, I gave a polite reply. "My younger brother is you." He remained silent for a moment. His eyes narrowed slightly, and his face was thoughtful. I was surprised when he asked almost cautiously, "Do you ever consider how different things would have been if Dad had been present more?" I stared at him, not knowing how to respond. He looked at me, and for a moment, the unadulterated vulnerability in his eyes made my chest ache. I finally responded, "I suppose, but you turned out pretty well, you know. You do not need his approval to feel proud of yourself." "Thank you," he said quietly. "This has great significance." We didn't speak for a bit after that, allowing the silence to settle in. The distant noises of the park filled the air. Rustling leaves, birds chatting, and a small squeak from the swings. It was serene, yet I could still feel the weight of his previous comments hovering between us. Jake eventually rose up, dusting his hands on his slacks. "We should go back," he said. "It's becoming colder." "Yeah," I responded, rising to my feet and falling in step with him. The walk home seemed longer than usual. The stillness between us was no longer comforting, but heavy with ideas that neither of us knew how to articulate. By the time we got to the house, I was eager to retreat to the guest room and clear my mind. But Jake had different ideas. "Let's play a game," he suggested, taking a controller with a devilish grin. "Tonight, the loser washes the dishes." "You're on," I said, happy for the distraction. With intense competition and outbursts of laughter, we immersed ourselves in the game for the next hour, which lifted our spirits. Jake won the most of the rounds as usual, but I was able to steal a few wins, much to his chagrin. The tension had diminished by the end, at least temporarily. As we turned off the console, I folded my arms in a phony sense of contempt and muttered, "I still don't do the dishes." He chuckled. "Okay, I'll let you off the hook this time." The rest of the evening was unremarkable. We ate dinner, discussed our plans for the next day, and then went about our typical bedtime ritual. However, as the home became quieter and the night progressed, the weird vibe from before returned. Despite my best efforts to ignore it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving between us. Later that night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I heard a tiny squeak from the floors just outside my chamber. My pulse increased, and I paused, listening as the quiet footfall approached. Then a soft knock. "Julia." Jake's voice was barely audible. I sat up with my heart beating. "Yeah. Can I come inside?" I hesitated, looking at the clock. It was late, and the house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. "What is wrong?" I need to talk to you," he murmured barely above a whisper. I inhaled slowly and swung my legs over the side of the bed. "Okay, come inside." The door creaked open and Jake walked inside, his expression unreadable as he locked it behind him. He leaned against it briefly before crossing the room and perched on the bed's edge. "What's happening?" I queried, keeping my voice steady despite the tense knot in my gut. He did not speak immediately, keeping his gaze fixated on the floor and his shoulders tense. Finally, he admitted, "I've been thinking a lot lately about us, regarding how much your presence has meant to me all these years." His remarks made my heart race, and I strained to maintain a neutral demeanor. "Jake, you are my brother." I spoke cautiously. "Of course we mean a lot to one another. That is what family is." "It's not just that," he mumbled barely above a whisper. "You've always been there for me like no one else has. You get me, Jake." I started, but he interrupted me. "I don't want to make things awkward," he replied quickly. "But I need you to understand how much you mean to me. I'm not sure what I would do without you." His words hung in the air, weighted with emotion I couldn't quite grasp. As the silence lingered, I stared at him. My thoughts jumbled.
"Jake."
I eventually murmured, my voice gentle yet firm. "I don't think you understand how hard it is to hear this." His expression faltered, and his brows furrowed together. "I am not trying to make things tough," he remarked calmly. I needed to say it to let it out." I took a long breath and ran my hand through my hair, trying to calm my thoughts. "You mean a lot to me, too," I confessed cautiously. "But we're siblings, Jake. We've always looked out for each other, because that is what a family does." His eyes clouded somewhat. "Sometimes I just feel confused, like I don't know where I stand with anyone." I shook my head, and my chest tightened. "You're just overwhelmed," I said. "We've both been through a lot, especially with Mom and Dad away so often. It's natural to feel close because of that." "It's not confusion," he said more softly. "It's just hard to process sometimes, but I know I need to work through it." I stood up from my bed and began pacing about the little room, attempting to make sense of everything. My thoughts were jumbled, caught between the desire to reassure him and the overwhelming sense that something had gone off track. I turned to face him and spoke strongly. "Jake, we can't keep having this conversation. It's not fair to either of us." His expression wavered. A short expression of pain appeared on his face. He muttered, "I'm not asking for anything. I just needed to let you know." The honest sincerity in his voice left me stunned. I took a slow breath and sat back down, my shoulders slumping under the weight of the situation. "I don't know how to answer," I confessed quietly. You don't have to, he added, his voice steady. I couldn't keep it to myself any longer. The room felt suffocating. The air was dense and difficult to breathe. There was nearly a dreadful tension between us. I hoped that I could fix everything. I wanted to return to a simpler time, but I was unsure of how to do it. We have to figure out how to move forward. He nodded slowly, but the doubt in his eyes remained when I finally said, You are my brother, Jake. That will never change. I'd rather not lose you, he admitted. I have no one who truly understands me except you. I understand. I spoke calmly as I consoled him. Nevertheless, we must set limits. We cannot continue to be stuck in this loop. The ensuing silence was stifling, but it seemed necessary. Jake paused for a long moment, then slowly and cautiously stood up. In a whisper, I apologize, he said. I never intended to make you uncomfortable. I understand. I responded gently, my tone kind. I'm not furious at you, but we need to be cautious, Jake, for the both of us. He nodded once more and paused at the entrance. He stood there for a second, as if confused whether to stay or leave. When he finally stepped out, the gentle click of the door closing behind him felt like a relief. Nevertheless, the tightness in my chest persisted. I sat there for what seemed like hours, staring at the empty space around me, trying to understand what had just happened. I couldn't articulate why, but I knew something between us had shifted. Something was changing, and I felt it. The following morning was abnormally quiet. The entire house felt different, as if the atmosphere had changed overnight. Jake did not join me for breakfast, and I did not force him. I convinced myself that he, like me, needed some distance, and that things would return to normal in due course. But as the hours passed, the quiet between us became heavier, more difficult to ignore. By the afternoon, I had decided to break the ice. I discovered him in his room, seated on the side of his bed with headphones on. When he noticed me knocking, he took them off and gave me a faint, tentative smile. Hello, I said, going inside. How are you holding up? He shrugged, lowering his attention to the floor. I am fine, he mumbled. I sat down next to him, leaving just enough space between us to be comfortable. I admit that this is weird right now, but I don't want it to stay that way. We need to work this out. I don't want it to be like this, he added, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm just not sure how to solve it. We'll sort it out, I told him with a tiny smile. It will take some time, but we'll get there. He looked at me, his expression softening. Thank you, he said earnestly, for not freaking out. I'm your sister, I stated simply. I will always have your back. For the first time in days, the tension appeared to ease, but only slightly. We kept talking, gradually, transitioning to lighter themes, his classes, his buddies, and plans for the weekend. By the time I left his room, the weight on my chest had shifted slightly. But as the home became silent again that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that things weren't quite right. Jake's words, his feelings, and all that had happened in the previous several days lingered in my mind, making me nervous and apprehensive. No matter how much I tried to tell myself differently, I knew this wasn't over. That night, the house was quiet, but my thoughts were anything but. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Jake's openness, his vulnerability, and the gravity of everything he had admitted stayed with me. I kept telling myself that everything would return to normal, that this was simply a hard period that we would get over. But deep inside, I wasn't sure. Then about midnight, I heard faint footfall in the hallway. My chest constricted as they got closer, halting just outside my door. I sat up, held my breath, and waited. Then came a gentle, cautious knock, just like the night before. Julia. Jake's voice was barely audible. I took a steady breath and forced myself to remain calm. Yeah, I whispered. Can I come inside? My heart pounded. I hesitated, looking at the clock. It was late and the home was dark and quiet, but something in me wouldn't let me turn him down. Okay, I replied softly. Come inside. The door creaked open and Jake walked in. He appeared uneasy, his hands sank deep into his pockets, his shoulders hunched slightly. He paused for a while before closing the door behind him, resting against it briefly before moving over to sit on the edge of my bed. I apologize, he murmured. I realize I shouldn't be here. It's fine, I said quickly, despite my beating pulse. What is on your mind? He paused again, his eyes fixated on the floor. I've been thinking about what I said earlier, and I'm worried I fouled things up. You didn't, I stated firmly, leaning forward. Jake, I told you we'd figure it out, but it will take time. I know, he said, his voice wavering. But it's hard. I'm stuck in my own head and don't know how to get out. I reached out and gently squeezed his shoulder. You are not alone, I told him quietly. We will go through this together. He looked up, his gaze catching mine. The intensity in his eyes caused a peculiar constriction in my chest. You've always been there for me, he replied, his voice full of emotion, especially when no one else was. I'm not sure what I would do without you. You don't have to think about it, I said in a calm voice. I'm not going anywhere. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The stillness between us felt thick, heavy with sentiments neither of us could express. Jake's expression was raw and vulnerable, which I had never seen before. It left me at a loss for words. I just want everything to be fine again, he said, his voice trembling slightly. I do not want to lose you. You won't, I assured, though my voice faltered now. But Jake, we need to set boundaries. We cannot let this take over. He nodded slowly, with a disturbed expression. I know. I'm trying. I know you are, I responded softly. And that's what matters. The tension in the room shifted, not completely. Gone, but no longer overwhelming. Jake remained still, his eyes searching mine. I spoke gently but firmly. Jake, we can't keep going in circles like this. It's not healthy for either of us. I know, he said just above a whisper. But I'm not sure how to move forward. Maybe, I suggested seriously, you need to face it head on and give yourself space to feel it. That's the only way to let it pass. His gaze lingered on me. His brow wrinkled as he processed what I said. You're right, he said slowly. It's hard, but I'll try. I smiled slightly. That's all we can do. He nodded, standing up and heading for the door. Good night, Julia. Good night, I replied, watching him go. As the door clicked shut behind him, I exhaled deeply. The moment was fleeting but important. A shift had occurred, not a perfect resolution, but a beginning. The next morning, something in the house felt different, lighter. Jake joined me for breakfast, more relaxed than before. Conversation came easier. As I packed to leave, we talked as if things were healing. At the door, Jake smiled. Thanks for staying. It meant a lot. I'm glad I did, I said. I'll come back soon. He nodded.
Yes.
We'll keep talking. We'll work it out. We will, I said. As I drove away, the weight of everything stayed with me. I didn't know what the days ahead would bring, but for the first time in a while, I believed we could find our way forward.